The night my son disappeared, I was arguing with him about a pair of sneakers. Let that sink in for a moment. Sneakers. $200 basketball shoes that he swore he needed more than oxygen itself. I remember standing in our kitchen, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like some angry insect, watching his face contort with that particular teenage rage that makes parents feel like they're living with strangers. He was 15 years old, tall for his age, with his mother's eyes and my stubborn streak running through him like a fault line. Xavier Rollins. My only son. The center of my entire universe. Even when he was screaming at me that I didn't understand anything, that I never listened, that I was ruining his life over something as stupid as money. The thing about that night, about February 14th, 2014, is that I can remember every single detail with a clarity that sometimes makes me wonder if I've been trapped in that moment ever since. The way the kitchen smelled like the leftover spaghetti we'd had for dinner. The sound of the rain just starting to tap against the windows like impatient fingers. The exact shade of red that crept up Xavier's neck when he got really angry, a tell he'd inherited from me. I remember the words I said to him, words that would haunt me for years, words that I would have given anything to take back. If you want those shoes so bad, Xavier, go find yourself a job. Go find someone else to buy them for you. Because I'm done trying to give you everything when you can't appreciate anything. He looked at me then, and something shifted in his expression. The anger drained away, replaced by something colder. Something that looked almost like disappointment. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the kitchen chair and walked out the front door. I stood there, arms crossed, convinced that he just needed to cool off. Convinced that he'd be back in an hour, maybe two. Ready to apologize, or at least ready to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. That was how these arguments always ended. That was the rhythm of our relationship in those days. Father and son locked in a constant battle of wills, pushing and pulling against each other like the tide. But Xavier didn't come back in an hour. He didn't come back in two. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, calling his cell phone and listening to it ring out to voicemail every single time. By 2 a.m, I was driving through the rain-slicked streets of our neighborhood, peering through the windshield at every figure I passed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. By dawn, I was sitting in a police station, trying to explain to an officer who looked barely older than my son that Xavier Rollins had vanished into the night, and I had no idea where to even begin looking. Now, I need you to understand something before we go any further. I know you might be thinking about clicking away right now. Maybe you've heard stories like this before. Maybe you think you know how this ends. But I promise you, what happened to Xavier Rollins in 2014 is unlike anything you've ever heard. The secrets that unraveled over the months that followed, the people who weren't who they claimed to be, the conspiracy that stretched back years before my son was even born, none of it will be what you expect. And if you're watching this right now, if something in your gut is telling you to stay, then trust that instinct. Because this story changed my life, and I have a feeling it might change something in you too. If you know what it's like to lose someone, to blame yourself for something you can't take back, then you need to hear what I'm about to tell you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to see this through to the end. Because the truth about Xavier Rollins isn't just my story. It might be yours too. My name is Marcus Rollins. In 2014, I was 43 years old, working as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company in Detroit. I'd been divorced from Xavier's mother, Denise, for almost 8 years by then. She'd moved to California right after the divorce was finalized, chasing some dream that never quite materialized, leaving me to raise our son alone. I won't pretend I was perfect at it. Single fatherhood isn't something they prepare you for, especially when you're a black man trying to navigate a world that seems designed to work against you and your child at every turn. But I tried. God knows I tried. I coached his little league team. I helped him with his homework every night, even when the math started getting beyond what I remembered from school. I sat through every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every basketball game where he warmed the bench more than he played. But somewhere along the way, something had started to shift between us. The easy affection of his childhood had given way to sullen silences and slammed doors. The little boy who used to run to meet me when I came home from work had been replaced by a teenager who seemed to resent my very existence. I told myself it was normal. I told myself every parent goes through this. I told myself that if I just held on long enough, the storm would pass and my son would come back to me. I never imagined he would literally disappear. The first 48 hours after Xavier went missing are a blur of activity and paralysis, of doing everything I could think of while feeling completely helpless. I must have called every one of his friends a dozen times. I drove to the school, even though it was the middle of winter break. I checked the basketball courts where he liked to practice, the corner store where he bought his candy, the park where we used to throw the football when he was younger and still wanted to spend time with me. Nothing. No sign of him. No sightings. No answers. The police, to their credit, took the case seriously from the beginning. A 15-year-old black boy missing in Detroit in the middle of February was not something they could afford to ignore, not with the media landscape being what it was, not with the community already on edge from a string of unsolved cases over the previous years. Detective Angela Morrison was assigned to lead the investigation, a woman in her 50s with silver streaking through her dark hair and eyes that seemed to have seen everything. She sat across from me in an interview room that smelled like stale coffee and asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. When did I last see my son? What was his state of mind? Did he have any enemies? Had he been acting differently lately? Was there anywhere he might have gone? Anyone he might have run to? I answered as best I could, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I realized how little I actually knew. Xavier had become a stranger to me over the past year, someone I lived with but didn't really know. I didn't know who his closest friends were anymore. I didn't know if he was having trouble at school. I didn't know if there was a girl, or a boy, or anyone he was interested in. I didn't know what he thought about when he lay awake at night, staring at his ceiling, earbuds in and music playing loud enough that I could hear the tinny echo from the hallway. The realization broke something inside me. I had been so focused on providing for my son, on keeping a roof over his head and food on the table, that I had forgotten to actually know him. 3 weeks after Xavier disappeared, I found the notebook. I had searched his room 100 times by then, turning out every drawer, checking under the mattress, going through his closet with a desperation that bordered on madness. The police had done their own search, of course, taking his laptop and phone records and anything else they thought might help. But the notebook, somehow, we had all missed it. It was hidden inside the lining of his winter jacket, the one he hadn't taken when he left that night. The one that was still hanging in the hall closet, waiting for a boy who might never come back to claim it. I don't know what made me check that jacket again. Call it intuition. Call it desperation. Call it some kind of spiritual guidance from forces I didn't believe in, but was starting to pray to anyway. Whatever it was, I found myself standing in the hallway at 3 in the morning, running my hands over the fabric of Xavier's coat, and my fingers brushed against something stiff inside the lining. A hidden pocket. One I hadn't known was there. The notebook was small, maybe 5 by 7 inches, with a black cover that had been worn soft from handling. When I opened it, I found page after page of my son's handwriting, cramped and urgent, filling every available inch of space. The dates started almost 6 months before his disappearance, back in August of 2013, and continued right up until February 12th, 2 days before he walked out our front door and into the unknown. I stayed up all night reading it. When dawn came, I was still sitting on Xavier's bed, surrounded by the posters he'd put up of basketball players and hip-hop artists, my eyes burning from lack of sleep and from the tears I couldn't seem to stop. Because the notebook told a story I had never imagined. It revealed a son I had never known, and it pointed towards something that changed everything I thought I understood about Xavier's disappearance. My son had been investigating something big, something that had started as curiosity and grown into an obsession that consumed his final months of freedom. It all began with a photograph. According to his notes, Xavier had found an old photo album in our attic while looking for Christmas decorations back in August. Among the pictures of his grandparents and distant relatives, there was one photograph that stopped him cold. It showed a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with features that looked startlingly familiar. She was standing in front of a building Xavier didn't recognize, holding a baby in her arms and smiling at the camera with an expression of pure joy. On the back of the photo, in faded handwriting, were 2 words, Elise, 1999. The baby, Xavier was certain, was him. But the woman was not his mother. I have to pause here and address something. Reading the thoughts and theories my 15-year-old son had poured into that notebook, I felt a confusion that I couldn't quite name. Because Xavier was wrong about some things. The photograph he'd found, the woman in it, there were explanations that he hadn't considered, assumptions he'd made that weren't entirely accurate. But he was also right about more than I wanted to admit. There were secrets in our family, secrets that I had kept from him, secrets that I had convinced myself he was better off not knowing. And those secrets had led him down a path that ended with him vanishing into a February night. The name Elise appeared again and again in Xavier's notebook. He had become convinced that she was his biological mother, that Denise, the woman he'd grown up calling Mom, had somehow been a stand-in, a replacement, a covering for something that had happened before he was old enough to remember. He'd spent months trying to track down information about this mysterious Elise. School library databases, internet searches, even, according to his notes, a few phone calls to relatives who had been less than forthcoming with answers. Reading about his investigation, I felt a strange mix of pride and horror. Pride because my son was clearly intelligent, determined, capable of following threads of information with a tenacity that surprised me. Horror because every step he took brought him closer to a truth that I had spent years trying to bury. Elise Thornton was real. She had existed, and she had been my first wife. We met when I was 20 years old, freshly graduated from high school, and working my first real job at an auto plant on the outskirts of Detroit. Elise was 2 years younger, still in school, brilliant and beautiful, and full of a fire that drew me to her like a moth to flame. We fell in love with the speed and intensity that only the young can manage, convinced that we had found something eternal, something that would last forever. We married 6 months after our first date, in a small ceremony at her grandmother's church, with only a handful of family and friends in attendance. By the time we were both 22, Elise was pregnant with our first child. The joy I felt during those months is something I still can't fully describe. Watching her belly grow, feeling the baby kick against my palm, imagining the future we would build together, it was the happiest time of my life. We named him before he was born, Xavier Marcus Rollins, after my grandfather and myself. We painted his nursery blue and hung little stars from the ceiling and talked endlessly about the kind of parents we would be. But something was wrong with Elise. Something none of us saw coming. It started with mood swings, which we attributed to pregnancy hormones. Then came the paranoia, the sudden conviction that people were watching us, following us, waiting to take our baby away. She became convinced that the hospital where we planned to deliver was unsafe, that the doctors couldn't be trusted, that we needed to run, to hide, to protect our child from forces she couldn't quite name. I tried to understand. I tried to be patient. I took her to doctors and therapists and anyone else who might be able to help. But Elise's condition deteriorated faster than anyone could intervene. 3 weeks before her due date, Elise disappeared. She left a note saying she was going somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't find her, somewhere our baby would be protected. I searched for her frantically, filed police reports, called everyone we knew. For 17 days, I heard nothing. I didn't know if she was alive or dead, if our child had been born, if I would ever see either of them again. And then, on a rainy morning that felt like the end of the world, police found her. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. Have you ever had to make a choice that would haunt you for the rest of your life? A choice where every option felt wrong, where every path led to pain, where there was no way to win, only different ways to lose. Think about that moment. Hold it in your mind. And then leave a comment telling me what you decided and whether you still think about it. Because the choice I made when they found Elise is the choice that set everything else in motion. And I'm still not sure if I made the right one. When police found Elise Thornton on that February morning in 1999, she was in a cabin in the woods of northern Michigan, alone except for a newborn baby boy wrapped in blankets She had knitted herself during her months of hiding. The baby was healthy, miraculously so, given the circumstances of his birth. Elise had delivered him by herself, in that cabin, with no medical assistance, nothing but her own determination and whatever primal knowledge exists in the bodies of mothers. But Elise herself was not well. The psychosis that had gripped her during the pregnancy had deepened into something darker, something that the doctors would later try to give names to: schizophrenia, postpartum psychosis, dissociative disorder. She didn't recognize me when I arrived at the hospital where they'd taken her. She looked at me with those beautiful eyes and saw a stranger, an enemy, someone who had come to take her child away. She screamed when they tried to let me hold Xavier. She had to be sedated, restrained, kept in a room with soft walls and constant supervision while our infant son was taken to the nursery and I was left to make impossible decisions. The doctors gave me choices that weren't really choices at all. Elise needed long-term psychiatric care, they said. Years, possibly. Maybe a lifetime. She wasn't capable of caring for herself, let alone a newborn. She wasn't capable of consenting to treatment, making decisions, participating in her own life. She was gone, even though her body was still there. She was lost in a labyrinth of her own mind that no one could navigate. And I had a son who needed a parent. I wish I could tell you that I visited Elise every day. I wish I could tell you that I fought for her, that I hired the best doctors, that I never gave up hope that she would recover. But the truth is more complicated and more shameful. I was 23 years old. I was terrified. I was alone with an infant who cried through the night, and a job that barely paid the bills, and a world that didn't seem to have any space for a young black man trying to hold the pieces of his shattered life together. Elise's family blamed me for what had happened to her. They said the pregnancy had pushed her over the edge, that I had pressured her, that I had ignored the warning signs. They wanted custody of Xavier. They wanted to erase me from the picture entirely. There were lawyers and court dates and a custody battle that drained every resource I had. In the end, I won. Xavier stayed with me. But the price was cutting ties with Elise's family entirely, agreeing to conditions that included never telling Xavier about his mother's condition, never bringing him to visit, never speaking her name in our home. I told myself it was for his own good. I told myself that a child didn't need to know that his mother was locked away in a psychiatric facility, lost in a world of delusions and hallucinations. I told myself that a clean break was kinder than a lifetime of confusing visits to a woman who might not even recognize her own son. I told myself a lot of things that helped me sleep at night. And then I met Denise. She came into my life when Xavier was 2 years old, a kind and patient woman who worked as a nurse at the hospital where I'd taken him for a childhood ear infection. She was good with him, gentle in a way that seemed to come naturally, and she never pushed me to talk about the shadows I carried. When we started dating, I told her about Elise, told her everything, and she didn't run. When I asked her to marry me, she said yes without hesitation. And when she suggested, gently, that it might be easier for everyone if we let Xavier believe she was his biological mother, I agreed. It was the coward's choice. I know that now, but at the time, it felt like survival. We rewrote the story of my son's origins. Denise became the woman who had given birth to him, the woman in the early photographs, the woman he called Mom without ever suspecting that she had only entered his life when he was 2 years old. Elise was erased, her existence reduced to a hidden photo album in the attic and a secret that Denise and I promised never to reveal. For 13 years, the lie held. For 13 years, Xavier grew up believing in a version of his history that I had constructed for him. And then he found that photograph. Reading his notebook, I could trace the path of his discovery with painful clarity. The photograph of Elise had shattered the reality he'd taken for granted. He'd started asking questions, quiet at first, then more insistent. Why didn't we have more baby pictures? Why didn't Mom ever talk about the pregnancy? Why did certain relatives get strange looks on their faces when they talked about his birth? I had brushed off his questions when he'd raised them with me. I had told him he was imagining things, that he was being dramatic, that he needed to focus on school instead of obsessing over old photographs. Every time I shut him down, every time I dismissed his concerns, I pushed him further into his own investigation. I pushed him toward the truth I had tried so hard to hide. And the truth, according to the final entries in his notebook, had led him to someone I never expected. Someone whose involvement in my son's life was about to change everything I thought I knew. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Moore, and she had been Elise's psychiatrist for the past 15 years. Dr. Evelyn Moore. I knew the name, of course. She had called me a few times over the years, trying to convince me to visit Elise, to bring Xavier to see his mother, to participate in what she called the healing process. I had always refused. I had been polite about it, professional even, but I had made it clear that that chapter of my life was closed. That Elise Thornton was no longer my responsibility. That my son didn't need to know the woman who had given birth to him in a cabin in the woods, convinced that the world was out to get her. Now, reading Xavier's notebook, I discovered that my son had found Dr. Moore on his own. He had somehow tracked her down, made contact, convinced her to tell him things that I had spent 15 years trying to hide. The entries describing their conversations were the longest in the notebook, the most detailed, the most emotionally charged. Dr. Moore had told Xavier about Elise, about the pregnancy, about what had really happened in the weeks after his birth. She had told him that his biological mother was still alive, still institutionalized, still waiting for a son who had never come to visit her. She had told him that I had kept all of this from him, and she had invited him to come meet his mother. The last entry in Xavier's notebook was dated February 12, 2014, 2 days before he disappeared. It read, "I'm going to see her. Dr. Moore said she could arrange it, that she could get me into the facility without Dad knowing. I need to see her. I need to know if she recognizes me. I need to understand why he lied about everything. I need to know who I really am." When I finished reading those words, I sat in silence for a long time. The sun had risen fully, casting pale winter light through Xavier's bedroom window, illuminating the space where my son had grown up, where he had become the person he was, where he had discovered the truth I had tried to bury. I should have felt anger at Dr. Moore. I should have felt betrayed, violated, furious that a stranger had taken it upon herself to destroy the careful fiction I had built around my son's life. But instead, all I felt was shame. Because Dr. Moore hadn't forced Xavier to seek out the truth. She had simply answered the questions he'd come to her with. The one who had set this tragedy in motion wasn't the psychiatrist or Elise or anyone else. It was me. Every lie I had told, every question I had dismissed, every opportunity one had missed to be honest with my son had led us to this moment. Xavier had gone looking for his identity because I had refused to give it to him. He had vanished into the night because I had made honesty impossible in our home. I called Detective Morrison immediately, told her about the notebook, about Dr. Moore, about the facility where Elise was being treated. Within hours, we had a lead, a direction, something to pursue after weeks of dead ends. The facility was called Brightwater Psychiatric Center, located about 3 hours north of Detroit, in a rural area that most people had never heard of. When Detective Morrison called them, they confirmed that yes, a young man fitting Xavier's description had visited on February 14th. He had come to see Elise Thornton. He had spent about an hour with her, and then he had left, and no one had seen him since. But here's where the story takes a turn that even I couldn't have predicted, because Xavier hadn't just visited his mother that day. According to the security footage that Detective Morrison obtained from Brightwater, my son had arrived at the facility in the passenger seat of a car I didn't recognize. And the driver, the person who had brought him there and waited for him in the parking lot the entire time he was inside, was someone I knew. His name was Malcolm Thornton. He was Elise's older brother, and he had been released from prison just 2 months before my son disappeared. Malcolm Thornton was a name I hadn't heard in over a decade. The last time I'd seen him was at my custody battle with Elise's family, when he'd stood across the courtroom and looked at me with pure hatred in his eyes. He had been 28 then, hot-tempered and protective of his sister, convinced that I had destroyed her life. 6 months after I won custody of Xavier, Malcolm had gotten into a fight outside a bar that left another man in a coma. He was sentenced to 15 years for aggravated assault. I had assumed, hoped, that he had forgotten about me, forgotten about Xavier, moved on with whatever remained of his life. But Malcolm Thornton had not forgotten. He had spent 15 years in prison, nursing his grievances, planning for the day he would get out. And when that day came, he had gone looking for his nephew. The nephew who had been kept from his family. The nephew who had been lied to about his own identity. The nephew who was desperate for answers and vulnerable to anyone who claimed to offer them. The revelation about Malcolm Thornton exploded the investigation wide open. Suddenly, we weren't just looking for a missing teenager who had run away from home. We were looking at a potential kidnapping case, a family vendetta that stretched back over 15 years, a situation that was far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. Detective Morrison put out an alert for Malcolm's arrest. Officers began canvassing the areas where he had been known to stay since his release. His parole officer was brought in for questioning and revealed that Malcolm had been increasingly erratic in recent weeks, missing check-ins, making cryptic statements about setting things right, and bringing the family back together. Everything pointed to a man who had been planning something, biding his time, waiting for the right opportunity. And Xavier, with his desperate search for his biological family, had given him exactly that. I wanted to help with the search. I wanted to be out there, driving through every town, knocking on every door, doing something other than sitting in my empty house and waiting for news. But Detective Morrison convinced me that I was more useful at home, ready to receive any calls that might come in, available for questioning if new evidence emerged. So I waited, and I remembered, and I tried to reconstruct the version of Malcolm Thornton I had known so many years ago. He hadn't always been violent. When I'd first met him, when Elise and I were young and in love and the future seemed full of nothing but promise, Malcolm had been almost welcoming. He was protective of his sister, yes, but in a way that seemed normal, healthy even. He'd invited me to family barbecues, taught me how to play spades, warned me with a grin that he'd beat me up if I ever broke Elise's heart. We weren't friends exactly, but we weren't enemies either. We were two young men connected by a woman we both loved, finding our way towards some kind of brotherhood. That changed when Elise got sick. Malcolm couldn't accept that his sister's mental illness was something that had been building for years, something with genetic and chemical roots that no one could have predicted or prevented. He needed someone to blame, and I was the most convenient target. In his mind, I had gotten Elise pregnant too soon, stressed her out with money problems, failed to notice the warning signs until it was too late. Every bad thing that had happened to his sister was somehow my fault, and the fact that I got to walk away with her son while she rotted in a psychiatric facility was the ultimate injustice. I understood his anger, even if I couldn't accept his blame. Losing Elise had destroyed something in me too, in ways I'd never really acknowledged. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness, and when Malcolm assaulted that man outside the bar, when he proved that his rage had escalated beyond words and dirty looks, I was relieved to see him locked away. I thought prison would contain him. I thought time would cool his fury. I was wrong on both counts. For days after the security footage from Brightwater surfaced, we got a break in the case. A woman in a small town called Pine Ridge, about 50 miles from the psychiatric facility, called in a tip. She had rented a cabin to a man matching Malcolm's description about 3 weeks earlier. He had paid cash, given a fake name, and asked not to be disturbed. She hadn't thought much of it until she saw his face on the news. The police descended on Pine Ridge with everything they had. Detective Morrison called me to tell me they were moving in, that I should stay by my phone, that this could be it. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I paced. I prayed. I bargained with God, with the universe, with anyone who might be listening. I promised to be a better father, to be more honest, to never take a single moment with my son for granted, if only he would come home safe. And then, just after midnight, my phone rang. They had found Xavier. He was alive. The relief that flooded through me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was physical, overwhelming, a wave that knocked me off my feet and left me sitting on my kitchen floor, sobbing into my hands while Detective Morrison's voice kept repeating through the phone that my son was okay. He was safe. He was asking for me. But even in that moment of joy, I could sense that the story wasn't over. There was something in Morrison's tone, a hesitation, a weight that told me there was more she wasn't saying. When I asked what had happened, when I asked about Malcolm, she went quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Rollins," she finally said, "I think you need to come up here. There are things Xavier needs to tell you. Things that are going to be hard to hear. But he wants you to hear them from him." I drove through the night to reach Pine Ridge. The roads were dark and empty, the winter landscape a blur of black trees and white snow, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions that had no answers. What had Malcolm done to my son? What had Xavier experienced in those weeks of captivity? What could possibly be waiting for me at the end of this drive that Detective Morrison couldn't tell me over the phone? When I arrived at the hospital in Pine Ridge, a small regional medical center that served the surrounding rural areas, Xavier was sitting up in bed, looking older than I remembered. It had only been a little over a month since he'd walked out our front door, but in that time, something fundamental had changed in him. The teenage petulance was gone from his eyes. In its place was something steadier, more mature, more knowing. He looked like a young man who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Dad," he said when I walked in. Just that one word. But it held everything. The relief, the regret, the weight of secrets finally ready to be spoken. I sat down beside his bed and took his hand, something I hadn't done since he was small enough to walk beside me with his tiny fingers wrapped around mine. We stayed like that for a long moment, not speaking, just existing together in the silence. And then Xavier began to tell me what had happened. Malcolm had found him through Dr. Moore. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but through the connections that exist in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. When Xavier had reached out to the psychiatrist asking about his mother, she had mentioned it to a colleague, who had mentioned it to someone at the facility, and eventually the whisper had reached Malcolm's ears. His nephew was looking for answers. His nephew wanted to know the family that had been kept from him. His nephew might be the key to everything Malcolm had been dreaming about during 15 years behind bars. Malcolm had contacted Xavier directly, introduced himself as an uncle who wanted to help, offered to take him to see Elise, to show him photographs, to tell him stories about the mother he had never known. Xavier, desperate for any connection to his hidden history, had trusted him, had gotten into his car, had let himself be driven to a cabin in the woods that wasn't so different from the one where he'd been born. But here's the part that changed everything. The part that Detective Morrison couldn't tell me over the phone because she knew it would need to come from Xavier himself. Malcolm hadn't kidnapped my son. He hadn't held him against his will. The time Xavier spent in that cabin was something else entirely. A kind of intensive family therapy, a crash course in Thornton history, an attempt to rebuild a connection that I had severed 15 years ago. Malcolm was troubled, yes. His methods were extreme, certainly. But he wasn't a villain. He was a broken man trying to put his family back together in the only way he knew how. And during those weeks in the cabin, Xavier had discovered something that made him see everything differently. His mother, Elise, wasn't just sick. She wasn't just a victim of mental illness that had randomly struck her down. The psychosis that had taken hold of her during pregnancy had a source, a trigger, something that the doctors had never fully explored because no one had asked the right questions. Elise Thornton had been poisoned. I need you to understand the weight of what Xavier told me in that hospital room. For 15 years, I had believed that Elise's breakdown was a tragedy of biology, a cruel twist of fate that no one could have predicted or prevented. I had built an entire narrative around that understanding, a narrative that allowed me to move forward with my life, to remarry, to raise my son, to leave the past where it belonged. But Xavier had spent weeks with Malcolm, going through old records, medical documents, letters and diaries that the Thornton family had kept. And what they had found painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. In the months leading up to Elise's pregnancy, she had been working as a research assistant at a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Labs. Her job involved testing new medications, documenting side effects, tracking patient outcomes. It was tedious work, but she had been good at it, thorough and detail-oriented in a way that impressed her supervisors. When she discovered she was pregnant, she had planned to take a leave of absence after the first trimester. She never got the chance. 2 months into her pregnancy, Elise had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. Documentation showing that one of Meridian's most profitable drugs, a widely prescribed anti-anxiety medication, had severe side effects that the company had hidden from regulators. effects that included psychosis in a small but significant percentage of patients, effects that Meridian had known about for years and deliberately concealed. Elise had tried to report what she'd found. She had gone to her supervisor, then to the company's ethics board, then finally to a journalist who had been investigating pharmaceutical corruption. But before any of her reports could gain traction, strange things started happening. Her files disappeared from her computer. Her witnesses recanted their statements. And Elise herself began experiencing symptoms that looked exactly like the psychosis she had been trying to expose. Malcolm was convinced that someone at Meridian had drugged his sister, had slipped her the very medication whose side effects she had discovered, knowing that it would discredit her, silence her, remove her as a threat. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The symptoms were too specific to be natural. And the company's aggressive efforts to bury the story in the years that followed only confirmed his suspicions. For 15 years, Malcolm had been trying to prove what had happened to Elise. The fight outside the bar that had sent him to prison hadn't been random violence. It had been an altercation with a former Meridian executive whom Malcolm believed had orchestrated his sister's destruction. And even from behind bars, Malcolm had continued investigating, gathering evidence, waiting for the day he would be able to bring the truth to light. Xavier had been the missing piece. As Elise's son, he had standing to request medical records, to demand answers, to pursue legal action in ways that Malcolm himself couldn't. And after weeks of reviewing the evidence Malcolm had assembled, Xavier believed his uncle was right. His mother hadn't been sick. She had been silenced. Sitting in that hospital room, listening to my son lay out a conspiracy theory that sounded like something from a movie, I felt my entire understanding of the past shift beneath me. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell Xavier that Malcolm had filled his head with paranoid fantasies, that the truth was simpler and sadder than any corporate cover-up. But something in my son's eyes told me he had thought this through. Something in the evidence he described rang true in ways I couldn't ignore. And then Xavier told me the final piece of the puzzle. During his weeks in the cabin, Malcolm had made contact with an investigative journalist who had been working on the Meridian story for years. Her name was Naomi Cross, and she had finally assembled enough evidence to take to the authorities. A former Meridian executive had agreed to testify. Documented proof of the cover-up had been obtained through a whistleblower inside the company. The story was about to break. And the executive who had agreed to testify, the one who had orchestrated the cover-up of the drug side effects, the one who had ordered the silencing of Elise Thornton and anyone else who threatened to expose the truth, his name was someone I knew. It was Charles Mitchell, the CEO of the manufacturing company where I worked. I won't pretend that the truth came easily. I won't pretend that exposing Charles Mitchell and Meridian Labs was a simple matter of presenting evidence and watching justice unfold. The months that followed Xavier's return were complicated, exhausting, full of setbacks and small victories and moments when I wasn't sure we would ever see the resolution we sought. But we fought, all of us, together. Malcolm, despite his extreme methods, had done the work of assembling evidence that couldn't be ignored. Naomi Cross published her investigation in a major national outlet, naming names, providing documents, telling the story of a pharmaceutical company that had poisoned a young woman to protect its profits. The former executive testified, as promised, laying bare the extent of the cover-up and the individuals responsible. Charles Mitchell was arrested on a Tuesday morning in June, walked out of the building where I had worked for over a decade in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment. The company's stock plummeted. Lawsuits piled up. Families of patients who had experienced psychosis from the hidden side effects came forward to tell their stories, adding their voices to a chorus of condemnation that Meridian could no longer silence. And Elise Thornton, finally, received the treatment she had needed all along. With the truth about her condition now understood, doctors were able to develop a new approach to her care. The symptoms that had been labeled as permanent psychosis turned out to be largely induced by the drug she had been given, effects that were treatable once the underlying cause was identified. It wasn't a miracle cure. 15 years of trauma couldn't be erased overnight. But slowly, steadily, Elise began to come back to herself, began to recognize the people around her, began to remember who she had been before everything was taken from her. The first time she truly recognized Xavier, 6 months after the story broke, I was there to witness it. We had driven up to Brightwater together, my son and I, making a trip that we now made every other weekend. When we walked into her room, Elise looked up from the book she had been reading, and her face transformed. "Xavier," she said, her voice uncertain but hopeful. "You're so tall. You look just like your father." My son crossed the room and sat down beside her, taking her hand the same way I had taken his in the hospital in Pine Ridge. And I watched them, mother and child, beginning the long process of knowing each other for the first time. I think about that moment a lot now, about what it took to get there, about the lies I told and the truth that eventually broke through, about a teenage boy who refused to accept the reality he had been given and went looking for a better one, even when the search took him into darkness. Xavier is 19 now. He's in college, studying journalism of all things, determined to become the kind of reporter who exposes the truths that powerful people want to keep hidden. We talk every week, sometimes more. We're honest with each other in ways we never were before. The distance that had grown between us during his teenage years has been replaced by something stronger, something forged in the fire of what we went through together. Malcolm is still part of our lives too. His parole was complicated by his involvement in Xavier's disappearance. But in the end, the authorities acknowledged that he had never harmed my son, never intended anything but reuniting a broken family. He lives in a small apartment near Brightwater now, visiting his sister regularly, slowly healing from the rage that consumed so much of his life. And Denise, the woman who raised Xavier even though she didn't give birth to him, she reached out last year for the first time since our divorce. She wanted to apologize, she said, wanted to explain why she had left, why she couldn't carry the weight of our secret any longer. We're not close, not the way we once were, but we're working on something that might become friendship. Another broken thing, slowly mending. I started this story talking about sneakers, about a stupid argument that sent my son out into the night, about the guilt I carried for years, believing that my words had driven Xavier away. But the truth, I see now, was so much more complicated. My son didn't leave because of sneakers or money or anything I said that night. He left because he was searching for himself, because the identity I had given him didn't fit, and he needed to find the one that did. If there's a lesson in Xavier Rollins' 2014, it's this: the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep we try to bury it. We can tell ourselves stories about who we are, about what happened, about why things turned out the way they did. But eventually, someone will dig. Someone will find the photograph in the attic, the notebook in the jacket, the evidence hidden in the files. And when they do, we have a choice. We can fight against the truth, or we can let it set us free. I spent 15 years fighting. Xavier spent 1 year digging. And in the end, his courage is what saved all of us. If you've made it this far, thank you for witnessing our story. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of truths you've been avoiding or questions you've been afraid to ask, I hope you find the courage to face them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories about the redemption that waits on the other side of honesty. And most importantly, be brave enough to stop running from the past. Because sometimes, the thing we're most afraid to find is exactly what we need to become whole.